It's another beautiful Sunday afternoon and my favorite time of the year. We're well into the Christmas season and another episode of It's Family Time, Let's Talk. My name is Ria Rupchansing and I will be your host for the duration of the series. Today we'll be discussing child poverty, unfolding child labour. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services said it will continue to prioritise the welfare of all children, youth and families. And by this, the ministry has affirmed its dedication to ensuring access to a range of programmes and services aimed at fostering the well-being and care of all members of society. For more information, these services can be found on the ministry's website, www.social.gov.tt. Joining me for today's discussion is Mr. Farouk Mohammed, who is the Chief Labour Inspector Specialist at the Ministry of Labour. Mr. Mohammed joined the Labour Inspectorate Unit of the Ministry in 1991. His jobs entail engaging, monitoring and enforcing labour laws relating to minimum wages, maternity protection and child labour. Also joining our panel is Dr. Judy Taklal Singh, who is the Training Officer at the National Family Services Division in the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Dr. Taklal Singh worked previously as the manager of the Interdisciplinary Child Development Centre in Couva. She is qualified with a degree in Educational Administration and a master's degree in Business Administration from the UWI. Dr. Taklal Singh has done extensive research in disability studies and has a passion for the overall well-being of children. Now, before we get into the discussions, viewers at home, remember that you can send your questions via our TTT Live online Facebook page, and you can give us a call at 622-4010. And with me, as I mentioned, do have Dr. Taklal Singh and Mr. Mohammed with us. And we're going to jump right into child poverty, find out exactly what is child poverty, how we can recognize child poverty, what we as a people can do, as an individual can do to aid, to prevent child poverty, as well as how we can enforce, not have children being abused with regards to the labour laws with respect to children. So let's get into the discussion. It's family time. Let's talk right now. As the first question I will pose to you, Dr. Taklal Singh, child poverty. We can probably have all these various, ways of which we would think or we would define or we would recognize child poverty. But tell us exactly how would that be defined? What is child poverty?
Okay, so Ria, first, good afternoon to all our guests, viewers. Child poverty that means children and their families, by extension their families, do not have enough money to cater for their basic needs. And those needs are food, clothing, water, shelter, medical, and educational services. Now, a lack of these things are going to put children at a disadvantage, those who are poor, that is. And because poverty on the whole is a multidimensional phenomenon, it's a complicated problem in any society because many factors come into play when you're looking at poverty. For children specifically, it is multidimensional, said to be multidimensional, meaning that it affects children in various ways, particularly physical development, emotional, cognitive. And when these are negatively impacted, it is going to cause children not to be able to give off their full potential. And of course, their rights will be trampled on as well. So it's a very important phenomena, something that needs to be looked at and explored to address child poverty so that children will not be faced, as poor adults as they grow older.
Now, as you say that and you tell us, what it is, it's what you would think child poverty is. But how easy or difficult is it to recognize that in a child? How can we recognize that in a child?
Okay, so I'll take that from like an education perspective. Most children anyway will be in school. So one of the easiest way to recognize a child who is poor is one by physical appearance in the classroom. Is the child properly clothed? Do they have the correct apparatus? Do they have materials for school? So physical appearance is one. Malnourished, if they look malnourished. I mean, teachers, I've been a teacher for many years, and you know the students in your classroom, and you can tell those who eat well. You look at their diet, how how they come to how they come to school, in terms of whether they are clean, hygiene, and also by performance. Usually, children who are disadvantaged or deprived in some way, they they don't perform very well. They are not the high performers. They always fall back in class. And so recognizing, looking at children in terms of their appearance, in terms of their performance is one. Attendance is another. Constant absenteeism is a red flag that something is going on in the home. Also, by knowing the family, whether they are employed or not, is a red flag again that children might be suffering from some sort of deprivation at home. Um, as well as knowing what communities these children are coming from. Unfortunately, there are some communities that are stigmatized. Hopefully, you wouldn't stigmatize the child, but knowing and having that idea where they're coming from, whether they are living in overcrowding houses, you know, and that is by talking to the parents, talking to the guardian, where those children are. And those are some sure signs, actually, to recognize that a child is impoverished.
And one of the things that stuck with me with what you said was speaking with the parents and knowing about the parents as well. And sometimes you only think that we look at the child and what the child presents to us, but it's stuck with me that we also need to know about the parents as well and know a little bit about their background, not wanting to pry, but trying to understand that so that we can actually help the child better, know the child's foundation, and possibly help that child better as well if there is poverty in that family.
Definitely.
So it's important to know the family background as well.
Of course, definitely. That's a sure indication. I worked with children, not wanted labeled, but from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And once you talk to the parents, you find out so much more about what goes on with children, whether it's incest, abuse, knowing the personality of the parents as well is important to determine the kind of assistance we can give to children in that respect, who coming from those type of backgrounds. It's important.
Okay, so that's child poverty. We're also going to be dealing with child labor as well. And as we go there, Mr. Farouk, tell us, does child labor exist in Trinidad and Tobago? And what is an indication that child labor is taking place in Trinidad and Tobago?
So good afternoon to you and good afternoon to your viewers. So child labor, yes, it does exist in Trinidad and Tobago, as it does across the globe. And all countries, I think, are affected by child labor. If we look at the international statistics, the last global estimates released by the International Labour Organization as at January 2020 estimated that there were approximately 160 million children across the globe involved in child labor. This represents 1 in every 10 children of age 5 to 17. So that's quite alarming in terms of numbers. From that, approximately 97 million are boys and 63 million are girls. So it affects boys more than girls. Almost half, or 79 million, are engaged in hazardous work, hazardous child labor work that is dangerous to their development. Coming closer to home, Latin America and the Caribbean region, we have approximately 8 million children involved in child labor. And the ILO estimates just over 1 million in the Caribbean region. There's a challenge with statistics for Trinidad and Tobago, but what we have found is there are reports of child labor more in the informal sector in Trinidad and Tobago. So for example, we have reports of children working on the beaches, by traffic lights on the highway, in shopping mall car parks, in the agricultural markets. So it's happening within the family environment, and it appears to be linked to poverty issues, economic challenges some families are facing. Hence, they are turning to their children in order to bring income into the home for the sake of the other siblings or for the family. So we have identified that. Now, some of the indicators of child labor, we look at three main indicators. So the first one is the age of the child. So the government of Trinidad and Tobago has declared 16 years as the minimum age for employment. So no one under the age of 16 years should be employed. So that's the first indicator. Is that child under the age of 16 years? The second indicator a labor inspector would look for when they're investigating is the child working during school hours? So that's the second indicator. And the third indicator is that child engaged in hazardous work or work that is dangerous to their health and their well-being. So those are the more common indicators we would look at with respect to child labor.
Now, you talk about hazardous areas. Some people may not understand exactly what hazardous areas would entail. What would you say? What would you describe as hazardous areas?
Right. So hazardous work could be exposed to dangerous chemicals. So they may be working in agriculture in a field and they're spraying crops. And exposure to those chemicals can be dangerous. They may be carrying heavy loads that their body can physically carry. And this can create problems for them, their physical growth later on in life. They may be exposed, for example, selling on the highway, exposed to traffic, getting knocked down by a vehicle, or they may be exposed to the elements such as the hot sun, rain, etc. So those are some of the hazardous issues that they can be exposed to. In addition to that, they can be exposed to some of the worst forms of child labor, such as trafficking of children, or engaging children in the sale of drugs, etc. So, for example, a child working on Maracas Beach, for example, sometimes unaccompanied without a parent or a guardian or an adult, they could be vulnerable to being trafficked. So there are issues involved there with respect to hazardous work and worst forms of child labor.
Okay. Well, it's family time, let's talk, and we are, in fact, talking about child poverty and unfolding child labor. Remember, you can join the conversation as well at our Facebook page, so you can check us out there, post your questions there, or you can give us a call at 622-4010. We want to hear from you if you've got any questions, if you want to contribute in any way to this discussion, and you can do that. TTT Live Online, that's our Facebook page, and 622-4010. And we took to the streets of San Juan to get the public's view on ways in which society can put a stop to child labor. Here are some of the comments made by both men and women.
As a society, how could you put a stop to child labor? I think we need to put more pressure on the authorities to do what they're supposed to do, to check up on places like groceries, because groceries normally hire younger people. So, yeah, put more pressure on the authorities to do what they're supposed to do and enforce the laws.
A child deserves to be a child. Do not force a child to become an adult before their time.
I think we can eradicate child labor by creating a better parent, where the parent should be working hard to support the kids so they will not child labor.
I think we can stop child labor by the authorities putting in the foot in everything that is going on that is wrong in the country. Not that we are the police for. The police are doing the work properly. And my comment.
Thank you for children, for child growth, because it's not right. You need to love children, not a picture and destroy children life. It's wrong for doing that.
How to get rid of child labor? The government had to get people work so the children have to help to pay the bills, like all the liabilities and whatnot.
A variety of views there about child labor, but we are discussing exactly what it is and what we can do to, in a sense, get rid of child labor. And from those comments that we just heard there in San Juan, we're going to ask Mr. Mohammed now the role, because they're saying somebody has to do something. The government has to do something, or somebody has to do something, and it's always the government that they turn to take a role in doing things. So tell me, what is the role of the Ministry of Labor and the National Steering Committee in protecting children from child labor? And tell us as well, what is the National Steering Committee? Because that's a relatively new committee that was formed. So what is that, and what role do they have in protecting children against child labor?
Sure. So the Labor Inspectorate Unit of the Ministry of Labor has the responsibility for investigating reports of child labor. So when reports come in, labor inspectors would visit the location. They would interview the child, the employer / parent or guardian, depending on who is engaging the child, and try to get the child out of that labor environment. But we recognize child labor, it's more than a labor issue. It's a social issue, it's an education issue, it's a health issue. It crosses different agencies in terms of monitoring and addressing. So based on that, Cabinet would have appointed the National Steering Committee for the Prevention and Elimination of Child Labor. This committee brings together 14 government agencies, 2 NGOs, and academia. And the role and function of this committee really is to develop a child labor policy, to develop policies and activities to prevent and eliminate child labor. So the committee has been divided into 4 subcommittees. The first subcommittee has the responsibility to gather data on child labor and to develop a monitoring and evaluation framework for all the activities of the committee. The second subcommittee has a responsibility of developing a hazardous and light work list. So we spoke about hazardous work a bit. So a child is really defined as anyone under the age of 18 years. However, some children can work from 16 to 18 as the minimum age for employment. So having a list of hazardous work that children 16 to 18 cannot be engaged in is a means of protecting them while they work as a child. So different hazards like chemicals and different machinery they might be exposed to, those industries, those sectors, those type of activities, children would should not be engaged in those activities. So that list, once it's developed, becomes part of the legislation. The third subcommittee has a responsibility of public awareness campaigns. We have developed a number of campaigns to engage children. We had a child labor art competition where we engaged children in depicting their views of child labor in art. We also ran a video monologue competition for children to get their views, a 1-minute video on what their views are on child labor and how we can prevent, eliminate it. And just recently we had a jingles competition. And we had prizes for the top entries. And we continue to engage children via social media to get their views from the public as well. We have visited schools, and we also visited shopping malls to raise awareness about child labor. And the fourth and last subcommittee has a responsibility of drafting a child labor policy. And this would be guided by data that the first subcommittee would be gathering, because policy must be data-driven. We need to know exactly what is the situation before we can really introduce programs or measures to address it. And the fourth subcommittee is also responsible for developing protocols. So protocols is important because labor alone, labor inspectors, Ministry of Labor alone cannot address the issue of child labor. So if a child is found in labor and we remove that child, chances are they would just go to another location, a month down the road, and continue in the labor situation. So there must be some sort of follow-up or support services for that particular child. So for example, the child is out of school, we would want to ensure the Ministry of Education is aware of that. If the child is a case of poverty, we would want the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to see what support services they can provide to that child and the family to avoid engaging them in child labor. There may be, the inspector may find elements of child abuse when they're investigating the case. Definitely Children's Authority, the Child Protection Unit of the Police Service would want to be engaged. So there are a number of agencies that really can provide support to the Ministry of Labor in addressing the whole issue of child labor.
And want to talk about child poverty as well because the both of them are related because it almost goes hand in hand. And what can result, Dr. Taklal Singh, if child poverty goes unaddressed? Because we're hearing all these things that are taking place, how they can be used as child labor to help, the family along with money, monetary purposes, and that type of thing. But I'm sure that the damage is even greater than just that. So, what can result if child poverty goes unaddressed?
Korea, well, as Mr. Mohammed said, one of the definite results is child labor if poverty is not addressed. Now, that's a red flag again.
Yeah.
But more than that, you have long-term negative impact on well-being, on a child's well-being, on the family's well-being. And that means that you can have long-term health issues, right? A child who is born into a poor home, research has shown that children born into extremely poor homes, and I'll explain extremely poor before you have poor and extremely poor, are twice as likely to die before the age of 5, right? So it is a situation that needs to be addressed very rapidly. You would have also educational disparities. Children who born into poor homes or growing up in poverty would not have that kind of support to go the further way, the further distance in education. So you would probably have that resulting in lower paid jobs. You will probably have a family with 2 children who's going to be born in that other that generational poverty. So you have that cycle of poverty resulting if a poverty goes unaddressed. You also have mental health issues in children. And some time ago, a couple of sessions ago on the same show, we spoke about the mental health issues for children, where they can be depressed or anxious, and they can have suicide ideation. Because while we talk about small children, you have teenagers that falls within the category of child poverty. So you have long-term illnesses also. You also have, if there's an intersection with poverty and disability, or poverty and long-term illness, and that is not addressed, then you have further consequences. And strange, Ria, even though you have individual, it affects the child individually, at an individual level, the impact is greater at the social level. Because if you don't address that social inequality, that is going to transcend to other generations and coming generations. You also, and we're seeing some of our concerns right now in Trinidad with the high crime rate and gang violence and that gang culture that we spoke about 2 or 3 weeks ago when we had a presenter here. That can manifest itself into violence and crime in a society, which changes the trajectory of the society as a whole. If it doesn't, if you don't address child poverty in that way, you also will have, from an economic perspective, a reduced productivity, because you're going to have a section of the population who have all this potential growing up, and it's not being enhanced by anyone. The family cannot afford to do it. If you have children who are institutionalized as well, you have a section of the population that, given different circumstances, they could probably be very helpful to the society. And so those are some of the long-term impact on poverty, child poverty goes unaddressed.
So, as you're talking about these long-term effects, are there strategies, things that we can do to prevent that from happening to children? What are some of the things that we can do to prevent child poverty from taking place?
Well, one is by investing in education and health issues. Just give me a minute. Right. So some of the strategies that you could look at individually, meaning that each person can do something, and there's different things you can do. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can mentor children in impoverished circumstances, you can advocate, and we have groups in the society that does that advocating for children who are poor. And at a community level, you can have things like community-based programs. For example, you can have libraries that are equipped. Let's say business community get involved with libraries, have a section where you have internet access for children or provide books, after school program, meal supplement. These are some of the things that you can do as a citizen to address that. At a more national level, you could look at improving basic income of families. And I mean, we do some of that in terms of grants and so on, that what we give to supplement that. For example, the food card and free medical services, provision of transport, and so on, helping families as well. Also, creation of jobs and employment, of course, is a sure way, because poverty is, the opposite is money, right? So having that for families to access those type of things are some of the ways that you can address poverty in the long term.
Child poverty is what we are discussing this afternoon, as well as unfolding child labor. In studio with me, Mr. Mohammed and Dr. Taklal Singh, and from the Labour Ministry, and of course from the Ministry of Social Development as well. So we've got both aspects of it right here. And we were talking about the age of children working, and in Trinidad and Tobago, the legal age really is 18, but some children may start at 16, and that's okay, that's allowed. But there's also the question, children, they say chores. And they say, oh gosh, it's child labor, you're giving a child to do chores, and they claim it's that. So first of all, what are chores considered child labor, and to what extent would it or may it be child labor? And also, we have so many young children, their businesses, their families have businesses. What about that with the child working in a family business, and how is that defined? So chores and then a child working in a family business. Mr. Mohammed.
Yes. So the government has identified 16 years as the minimum age for a child to work. And as I mentioned earlier, a child is defined as someone under the age of 18. So someone who is 16 to 18 can work legally, although they're still considered a child. And this is in line with the Education Act, which makes it says it's mandatory for a child 5 to 15 to be in school. So that is really it's aligned with the Ministry of Education and the labor legislation. Under 16, it's considered illegal. However, there are some exceptions to the legislation in terms of a child under the age of 16 working. So doing chores in the home, helping out in the kitchen garden, running errands for the family, those are child work or activities that are considered positive. Things like working in the family business, earning pocket money during the vacation period, for example, can help a child to develop skills and attitudes and experience that helps them to grow and become productive adults. So there's a difference between child work and child labor. Child labor comes into the picture when the child begins to miss school, for example, totally, or they may be required to combine long hours of work with school, which means that they may fall back in terms of their schoolwork. Their time to do homework, their time to interact with their peers, to socialize, for example. So when it goes into those realms, then it moves from child work to child labor. So although it's okay for a child to work in the family business, once it's impacting on their education, their school, and they may be engaged in hazardous work, lifting heavy objects in the shop, then it becomes child labor. It moves into the realm of child labor.
Okay. So is it okay then for a child, once they're the age of 16, to have an after-school job? It may not be the holidays, but they've got an after-school job. It's okay if they've got that, as long as it's not a hazardous type job, and it doesn't affect their school. Their school work and that type of thing.
Yeah, mainly we look at the impact in school when they are under the age of 16. So they may or may not be in school at 16 to 18, but they can legally work from the age of 16, however, not in hazardous work or work that is dangerous to their health and their upbringing.
Is there any other limit to that? For example, hours that they can work as
Yeah.
well, especially if it's in the holidays. Adults work, a normal 8-hour day. Is it different, or would it be different for children?
Yes. So from 16 to 18, there are some restrictions in the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So a child cannot work at nights. There is limitation in terms of the number of hours. They can work an 8-hour day once they're legally 16 to 18 years. They cannot work for more than 44 hours per week. If it goes beyond that, it goes into child labor.
Almost like a regular adult, though.
Yeah. So there are some restrictions. They cannot work in certain factories, operating certain machineries, certain sectors, for example. The employer is required to keep a special register of information for these young persons. And in some instances, they're required to have a medical examination done before they can actually engage in certain types of employment. So there are some restrictions with respect to the 16 to 18-year-old in terms of the types of work and the limits in the hours and that they can work.
Okay. You also mentioned, types of child labor. What are some of the worst forms? You did mention some of those where you were talking about trafficking and that type of thing, but there are so many more. Tell us some more about those.
Right. So there's the traditional form of child labor, which is a child maybe selling agricultural produce on the streets, and then there's the worst forms of child labor. And these are more going into the criminal issues. So for example, trafficking a child for labor exploitation or sexual exploitation is considered one of the worst forms of child labor. Engaging a child in pornography, pornographic pictures, etc., that is, again, one of the worst forms of child labor. Engaging a child in drugs, production or selling of drugs, again, that is child labor. Now, members of the public may look at these as being criminal issues, a child involved in criminal issues, but usually there's some adult behind the scenes who is manipulating the child to be engaged in these worst forms of child labor. And they may not see it as child labor, but it is definitely the worst forms of child labor. And responsibility for investigating these cases lie, for example, with with respect to child trafficking, with the counter-trafficking unit of the Ministry of National Security, with respect to children in arms and ammunition, drugs, etc. The Child Protection Unit of the Police Service would investigate those cases. Hazardous work, we have the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. Hazardous work is actually considered one of the worst forms of child labor as well. It's dangerous to their well-being, etc. So those are the more common forms of the worst forms of child labor.
And I'm glad that you cleared it up because, normally when you think of child pornography, child trafficking, you don't really associate it with the labor part of it so much, but more the criminal aspect of it. So I'm glad that you put those two together, that it is actually a labor issue that we're dealing with. Because as you said, it is usually an adult who is manipulating and orchestrating all of this and having the child do this.
Yep.
So I'm glad that you put that into perspective for people who may, may not have understood that's what it is, and it's a sort of a gray line for them.
Correct.
I want to get back to Dr. Taklal Singh because I know you were talking about strategies as well that we can adopt to address child trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago, and there was something that you wanted to add to that, Dr. Taklal Singh.
Yes. What I wanted to say is that we have to make that distinction between equal access and equitable access. So we in Trinidad and Tobago, we have equal access, all children, to free education up to the age of secondary school, free medical services. But when children or families are so impoverished and they don't have money for transport, they don't have money for food, equal access comes into question for those children. A child who is disabled, for example, and poor, cannot have assisted devices to get to that free service. You cannot reach the school on time, so you don't come to school. And therefore, equal access is not the same as equitable access. Equitable is a more just system. So we might ask, how you going to address this?
That's the thing,
right?
because that's what I'm thinking. How do you fix that?
How
do
you
you
fix
make
that?
it even ground for everyone?
Right. And so therefore, that is where resources and policies and legislation and so on come into play in making that service available for those children who cannot access it. So if they cannot come to the service have to go to them. So policies or let's just take transport, for example, where I worked before, catering for low socioeconomic children coming to the center could not reach there. And the problem was transport. And because transport is money, it also means some parents are working, or single parents who are working cannot bring their children. So childcare is another thing that, they don't have persons to help do that. So I just want to make that distinction. And equal access, you can't just say, well, it's available for everybody, and therefore it is the responsibility of your parents to get your children there. Some parents simply cannot, right? And that is where, again, we need research to be done, and which communities need it more, and what facilities that we can offer to these families to have that service accessible so that children can, benefit from the service that is provided by the government.
And as you talk about services, are there services that are being offered by the Ministry of Social Development, the MSDFS and the NFSD, that can actually assist these families, these poor families, and then as a result, these poor children? What services are there available?
Okay, so we don't really call it, but we assisting. We have a policy for child poverty just like that. We go through the family aspect of it, because you can't talk about children without their families, right? So yes, the ministry have quite a bit of services. The Ministry of Social Development, we have quite a bit of grants. We have the public assistance grant. We have disability grant for minors, disability grant for adults. We have senior citizen pension and so on, because grandparents take care of children as well. So we have a list of grants, and of course, once you call in, you can get that information that we can offer those services to persons who are experiencing poverty. And also, at this time, the ministry is engaged in doing a national poverty reduction strategy. They are also engaged in registry for vulnerable persons, looking at the migrant population. So there are these are initiatives that are currently being worked on. NFS provides services for families, number of services, including training, and all of this is free of charge. Training for parents. Recently, we launched our parenting program, I think this week gone, right?
It was,
so parents could log on to that and sign up to get all the courses that we are running. We have, in terms of financial workshops for parents, because when you're talking poverty, sometimes parents cannot budget what they have. They don't know financial literacy. So we offer those services. We offer guidance and counseling services. We also have parental workshops and referrals again. So if something comes to us and we don't have that technical ability, we can refer it to the various departments, whether it's TTPS, Children's Authority, Childline, whatever service is available. But yes, the ministry is engaged in, actively seeking to reduce poverty in families.
And how can one get in touch with the ministry if someone wants to come in, they have issues, they want to access one of those grants? How can that happen? Okay,
so you come in. Our head office is on St. Vincent Street, or you can call our NFS numbers, which is 623-2608, extension 6710 to 6713. So call, make an appointment, talk to one of our very qualified social workers, and I'm sure we will get the help that you need.
And it's totally free.
And it's totally free.
Totally free. And even all the services that with the National Parenting Program that was launched,
Yes.
all those services that are being offered are also free.
All free. All
They're all
free.
free.
It is
So if you
there.
need the help is there. You just have to get in touch with the ministry.
Correct.
And they will help you. Because, we're talking child poverty. And when we think child poverty, I think we think of it as a separate entity from adult poverty. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But Dr. Taklalse can actually answer that question for us. What is the concept exactly of child poverty? Is it different? And how is it different from adult poverty?
Okay, Ria, well, thanks for that question. Poverty on the whole is a deprivation of well-being. And for children, it's different to adults. So I'll just use an example. In a family, there are 2 adults and 2 children experiencing poverty. The effects it's going to have on that child or those children is going to be very different from the adult. Because one, children do not have agency, right? They cannot make decisions on their own. They cannot take care of their own needs. So there's that dependency on adults to provide for that. Whereas you have a poor adult and you take a bunch of money and give it to him, he can utilize that for his own well-being and probably raise himself out to the next level out of extreme poverty because he has already the mental faculties to do so. Children, on the other hand, it is known, and at least research has shown, that a child's brain development happens in the first 5 years of life. So if that child is poor from birth or from the age of 1 or 2, that brain development is going to be affected negatively.
Because of nourishment.
Because of nourishment, because of health issues, right? Because of safety and security issues, so it is different in terms of their development status, age and stage development, and that dependency. But strange enough, we say they depend on us for protection, but we also depend on these children as coming up, taking over what we have, right? So in terms of social stigma as well, it affects children very badly because they could be subjected to bullying.
Yes.
They could be subjected to, again, child labor, exploitation, prostitution. So the difference is stark. You can't really, there's no comparison with adult poverty to child poverty because children can actually die much faster under poverty than an adult can.
Pretty much more vulnerable than adults are.
Yeah, they're at risk. They are much more vulnerable to all forms of exploitation.
And so in that event, and especially I'm thinking, being a teacher as well, you really need to pay attention to the children coming into your care, coming into the classrooms, pay attention to them. Take note, because one thing that we used to do at lunchtime and things like that, we would actually walk around the classroom, especially in the infant department as they come in, and see what sort of lunches they had.
Correct.
So we would, sort of figure out from there who might have, who didn't have. And we were as teachers, would try to supplement. I don't know what's done now, but we would tend to, do that. But we would check to see, and if there was a red flag in what we saw, we would try to call in the parent. As I mentioned, the parent needs to get involved as well.
And that is a really good, you bring up that nutrition problem, but one way that was addressed, and it's very commendable, is the school feeding program.
Yes.
And because we recognize that nutrition is the most basic need a child need. So looking at that, and yes, as teachers, that's why I said that teachers are in the correct position to identify that very quickly from early childhood straight on to primary school, secondary school. And if we can actually, it's easy to label a child as bad behaved. Or if a child is obese, you might think that child is well nourished, which is a fallacy, right? And behavioral problems also is an indication. Children who undergo in poverty, they can be silent, they cry a lot, they are depressed, and it's they're withdrawn, and they're so innocent. And I mean, I've worked with teachers who would beat children if they're behaving badly, because it's frustrating. But then you have to go look beyond that. Look beyond what is causing that child to be behaving the way that child is behaving. And most of the time, it's in the family circle that you need to look at, to address that problem.
There's so many things that you really need to do as a teacher these days, and I hope
Yes.
that teachers out there are taking note of that. It's not just going into the classroom and teaching, it's so many other different things that you have to do as a teacher to be a good teacher and to be a good person at the same point in time as well.
And and children remember that.
Oh, they do.
I mean, we have to remember that children are young adults.
Yes.
Right? They are going to be adults, and they remember what not just teaching maths and English, but they remember
kind
you giving them a meal, or you giving them some money to buy a snack.
Child labor is actually a form of child abuse. These reports, particularly for those younger children who are exposed to these elements, for example, is very dangerous. They can become dehydrated, a number of health challenges they can face later on in life. So if persons are not sure, they can report the case to the Ministry of Labor, and we will investigate to determine whether it's actually child work or child labor.
All right. So, child poverty, unfolding child labor, we're almost at the end. Dr. Taklal saying final words on child poverty.
Yes, I would like to appeal to everyone who's looking on that if there is one family you can assist that has one child, and at an individual level, if you can just do that and just assist in one family, please do so, because I think eliminating child poverty is a collective commitment, right, to safeguard that innocence and those dreams that children have. And if we can rewrite that childhood trajectory, if we have that ability as adults to do it, let us do so to create a better world, a better Trinidad and Tobago, where no child is left behind.
I love it. And Mr. Mohammed, your final words from the Labour Inspectorate.
So we recognize that the pandemic would have impacted families. It happened, the government had to introduce certain measures to limit the spread of the virus, and this would have impacted on families' income, loss of job, closure of businesses, for example, closure of schools, the introduction of online classes. Some children may have missed or unable to access the online schools, for example, internet access or portable devices. And we recognize that some of these families are facing hardship, and they may feel that the only resort that they have is turning to children to engage them in child labor, to put food on the table. But there are a number of programs, social programs available at the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. So even if they reach out to us, we can advise families, or when we find these cases, advise parents, well, there are other alternatives to engaging children in child labor. We believe children should be given every opportunity, including their education, to reach their full potential. The children of today is the workforce of tomorrow, so we depend on them to take care of us when they become adults, and to move the country forward. Yeah, thank you.
Generally, don't abuse them at a younger age.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Farooq Mohammed, Dr. Julie Taklal Singh, for this discussion this afternoon, child poverty and unfolding child labor. Thank you so much for joining us, your viewers at home, as well as those who sent in questions, and it was a pleasure. You can join us at the same time next week for another edition of It's Family Time. Let's Talk. Have a great afternoon.